My name is Leah Morton, and the day I opened that box, something inside me stopped trusting the word family. I sat on the living room floor surrounded by ribbons and tissue paper, expecting at least a small gesture of warmth from my parents. What I found instead was a cheap blender still wrapped in store plastic, its price tag barely scratched off. I stared at it for a long time, unable to decide whether to laugh or cry. My parents had once spent $90,000 on my sister Denise's extravagant wedding. The whole town in Boise talked about it for weeks. They hired a string quartet, filled the hall with imported lilies, even rented a horse-drawn carriage so she could arrive like royalty. Now it was my turn, and this was what they thought I deserved: a kitchen appliance that hummed louder than their affection. Mom smiled as if handing me a priceless treasure. "Be grateful, sweetheart. Not everyone gets a gift." Dad nodded beside her, satisfied, like fairness had been checked off a list. I thanked them quietly because it was easier than arguing, but the silence between us was heavier than words. Inside, a decision formed with a calmness that scared me. If this was how little my wedding meant to them, then they didn't need to be there when it happened. As I placed the blender back in the box, I felt something else closing too, the last bit of hope that they'd ever see me the way they saw her. If you've ever been treated like your love or effort meant nothing, stay with me. Hit subscribe, because what happened next changed everything I believed about family. Back when I was still in school in Boise, I started to notice how love in our house had a shape, and it always seemed to fit my sister. At every family gathering, her name filled the air before anyone even asked how I was doing. My father, Howard Morton, would stand near the dining table and talk proudly about Denise's grades, her charm, her popularity at school, as though she were the family's shining banner. When I tried to share my own news, like a science project award or a poem published in the school newsletter, his attention slid past me to refill his glass or change the subject. My mother, Sylvia Morton, never meant to hurt me, but her words carried a quiet sting. "Don't start drama, Leah. Just let your sister shine." She said it with that tired smile that always ended conversations before they began. It was her way of keeping the peace, but it taught me that silence was easier than disappointment. Denise and I shared a room for years. Her side was covered with photos of cheerleading ribbons and invitations to parties I was never asked to join. Mine had books stacked neatly on a small shelf and a single poster of the night sky. We lived together, but it felt like we were breathing different air. She had laughter and attention. I had quiet corners and half-finished sentences. When I earned a scholarship to the state university, I thought that maybe this time my parents would see me. I showed them the acceptance letter, expecting excitement. Mom said, "That's wonderful, honey," and returned to chopping vegetables. Dad glanced at the paper, nodded, and said, "Good job," before asking if I could drive Denise to her practice later. I smiled and said yes, pretending that indifference didn't hurt. The only person who seemed to notice my effort was Grandma Helen. She lived with us for a few years after Grandpa passed away. She had a sharp sense of humor and a softer heart than she ever admitted. When she caught me studying late at night, she would bring warm milk and whisper, "Sweetheart, kindness doesn't need applause. Keep doing what you do, and life will return it in its own time." Her words settled in me like a seed. Over the years, I learned that the safest way to survive in that house was to stay small. I became quiet, not because I had nothing to say, but because I knew no one would listen. I learned to celebrate my victories alone, with soft music in my room and the hum of my desk lamp as my only witness. While Denise moved through life surrounded by attention, I built a world that depended on no one's approval. By the time I left for college, I had mastered the art of invisibility. It wasn't bitterness that drove me to it, just exhaustion. I no longer tried to compete for the spotlight. Instead, I focused on what I could control: my work, my calm, my distance. Looking back, I can see that the distance I built was not just from them, but from the version of myself that still believed I could earn their affection if I tried hard enough. 3 months before the wedding, the sky over Arrow Rock Lake looked like glass, calm and endless. The water reflected the fading light, and for the first time in a long while, I felt peace instead of hesitation. Adam and I had driven there for a quiet weekend away from work and noise. We sat by the shore eating sandwiches, our shoes half buried in the sand, laughing about nothing important. When he suddenly grew quiet, I turned and saw the small velvet box in his hand. His voice trembled slightly when he said my name, but his eyes held steady warmth. Leah, you've spent your whole life making others feel seen. I want to spend mine making sure you never feel invisible again. Will you marry me? The world seemed to blur. For a heartbeat, I couldn't breathe. When I nodded, the sound that came out of me wasn't even a word. It was relief, joy, and disbelief mixing together. He slipped the ring onto my finger, and the gold caught the last rays of sunlight. I remember thinking how simple happiness could be when no one was measuring it against someone else's. That night, back in the cabin, I sat on the bed and dialed my mother's number. My hands shook, not from doubt but from hope. She answered on the second ring, her voice familiar and distant all at once. "Mom, Adam proposed," I said, smiling even though she couldn't see me. For a second there was silence, then a small, polite laugh. "That's wonderful, dear. Have you told your father?" Before I could reply, I heard his voice in the background, faint but unmistakable. "That's nice," he said. "Just don't make it a spectacle." The air left my chest as if someone had opened a window in winter. I forced a laugh, told them we hadn't decided on anything yet, and hung up before the conversation could turn into another reminder of how little they thought my milestones mattered. Adam walked in holding 2 mugs of tea, smiling as though nothing could go wrong. I didn't tell him what Dad had said. I didn't want to stain the moment with old disappointments. For the next few days, I moved through a quiet euphoria. I started sketching plans for a small ceremony near the lake, something intimate and real. Adam's parents were thrilled when they heard the news. His mother cried. His father hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. Their warmth felt foreign but comforting, like sunlight through an open door. One evening, I opened my laptop and typed "save the date" templates, imagining my parents' names on the guest list. Part of me wanted to delete them immediately, but another part hesitated. There was still a small hope tucked deep inside me, the same one that had survived every dismissal and every quiet heartbreak. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe love had softened them with age. I began to call Mom every few days, sharing pieces of the planning. She listened politely, her voice always measured, as though every word had to pass through some invisible filter before reaching me. Once she said, "Well, weddings can be a lot of work. You might not want to overdo it." I swallowed my frustration and replied, "We're keeping it simple. I just want it to feel like us." She didn't answer for a moment, then murmured, "That's nice, Leah." I kept her updated anyway. It wasn't the words that mattered. It was the chance, however small, to build something fragile between us. I told myself that people could change, that even the coldest rooms could warm again if you opened the curtains wide enough. On the night before we sent the invitations, Adam asked me if I wanted to double-check the guest list. I looked at the screen and saw their names written clearly beneath bride's parents. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The memory of Dad's voice still echoed, but so did the sound of Adam asking me to marry him under that open sky. I took a deep breath and whispered, maybe love could finally be enough. 2 weeks later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, I drove to my parents' house with a freshly baked apple pie wrapped in a checkered towel. The smell filled the car, and for a moment I convinced myself that warmth could still fix old cracks. I parked in the familiar driveway lined with trimmed hedges and tried to ignore the flutter in my chest. Maybe today would be different. Maybe love had finally started to settle where pride used to live. Mom opened the door before I could knock. She looked surprised, then smiled quickly, the kind of smile that stayed on the surface but never reached her eyes. "Leah, what a nice surprise," she said, stepping aside. The house smelled like lemon polish and roast beef, perfectly ordinary, perfectly unchanged. Dad sat in his recliner reading the paper glasses perched low on his nose. He looked up and said, "Didn't expect you today." His tone wasn't unkind, just detached, like I was a neighbor stopping by out of courtesy. "I brought pie," I said, holding it out as if it were an offering. Mom took it and nodded. "How thoughtful, dear." We were just about to have coffee. She placed it on the counter and gestured for me to sit. I waited for her to ask about the wedding, but she didn't. The silence stretched until Dad folded his newspaper and cleared his throat. "We have something for you," he said. "A little early wedding gift. Thought you'd appreciate something practical." He disappeared into the hallway and returned with a small cardboard box wrapped in silver paper. My pulse quickened. I smiled, hoping this was the moment when everything shifted, when years of distance melted into something tender. I peeled the paper slowly, careful not to tear it. Inside was a plain white box. When I lifted the lid, the air left my lungs. It was a blender. A basic off-brand blender, the kind sold on clearance at the department store. Next to it was a folded card in Mom's handwriting. "For your kitchen, something practical." The words felt heavier than the appliance itself. I stared at the box, unable to speak. My mind flashed to the memory of Denise's engagement, the diamond bracelet Dad had given her to remind her she deserved the best, the custom Italian gown Mom couldn't stop showing to her friends. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay even. "That's all." The words slipped out before I could stop them. Mom smiled, oblivious or pretending to be. "You're starting small, honey. Keep it real." The room went quiet again. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to fill the gap. I wanted to ask why real always meant less when it came to me. Instead, I smiled back, the polite kind that hides everything it means. "I'll keep it real, Mom," I said softly. Dad nodded, satisfied, as if something important had been accomplished. "That's the spirit," he said. Mom poured coffee and changed the subject to the weather. I stirred my cup without drinking, watching the cream swirl into pale clouds. For a moment, I thought about telling them how much that moment hurt, how even simple words could bruise. But I knew better. When I stood to leave, Mom hugged me lightly. "We're proud of you, Leah," she said. The phrase sounded practiced, like a line read too many times. I walked back to my car, holding the box carefully against my side. It wasn't the weight that made it hard to carry. It was everything it represented, the difference between love that shows and love that only claims to exist. As I started the engine, the sky outside dimmed into soft gray. In the rearview mirror, I saw their front door closing, slow and final. I whispered to myself, half promise, half warning. Next time, I'll keep it real. That night, rain tapped against the windows in slow, steady rhythm. The sound filled the small apartment, soft yet persistent, like the thoughts I could no longer push away. I sat on the couch with my hands around a mug of tea gone cold. The box with the blender still sat in the corner, unopened, the silver wrapping torn and wrinkled. Adam noticed the silence between us, the kind that holds more meaning than words. He turned off the television and sat beside me. "Something happened, didn't it?" he asked gently. I nodded, staring at the rain sliding down the glass. "I went to see them today," I said. My voice felt smaller than I intended. "They gave me a gift, a blender." I tried to laugh, but it caught in my throat. Adam weighted his eyes, calm, not pitying, just patient. "They said it was practical, that I should keep things real." He leaned back, quiet for a moment. The clock ticked, and the world seemed to shrink to just the sound of rain and breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "We don't need approval to be happy, Leah. We never did." The sentence hung in the air, warm and heavy. I looked at him, at the certainty in his expression, and something inside me shifted. For years, I had carried the weight of waiting for acknowledgement, waiting for fairness, waiting for love that wasn't rationed like a favor. I realized I had spent my whole life hoping my parents would see me, when the truth was, they had always chosen not to. The rain grew heavier outside. It blurred the streetlights, turning the world into streaks of gold and gray. I set the mug down and stood by the window. My reflection stared back, older, somehow steadier. "Maybe it's time we stop waiting," I whispered. Adam came closer and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Then let's make it ours," he said softly. "No expectations, no conditions. Just us." The simplicity of those words felt like a lifeline. I nodded, my heart both breaking and healing at once. I turned to my desk and opened the wedding binder. The guest list lay on top, names written neatly in black ink. I picked up a pen and stared at the page. My hand didn't shake. One by one, I drew clean lines through the names of my father, my mother, and my sister Denise. The ink bled slightly, but my chest felt lighter with each stroke. I imagined the ceremony not in a rented hall, but in the backyard of Adam's mother's house, surrounded by people who wanted to be there, not out of obligation, but out of love. I pictured strings of soft lights, the smell of rain lingering in the air, the sound of laughter that didn't need to be forced. It was simple, honest, and real, everything I had been told to settle for, but never truly had. When I finished, I set the pen down and closed the binder. Adam squeezed my hand. "You sure?" he asked. I smiled faintly. "I've never been more sure." We sat there together, listening to the rain soften until it became a whisper against the glass. The room felt quieter, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after truth has been spoken aloud, when peace replaces the noise you didn't realize you were living with. Outside, the rain began to ease. I leaned my head on Adam's shoulder, watching the drops fade one by one. Some endings, I realized, don't need shouting or doors slammed. They happen in silence when you finally decide you've had enough of pretending. Some goodbyes happen without a single word. A week before the ceremony, the afternoon light stretched across the apartment in long golden lines. I was arranging jars of flowers on the kitchen table when a knock sounded at the door. I wiped my hands on a towel and opened it to find Denise standing there, one hand on her hip, the other holding a designer handbag. Her perfume arrived before her words did. "Leah," she said, smiling too wide. "Thought I'd stop by. It's been ages." I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." She walked through the doorway as though inspecting a model home, her eyes scanning the space, noting every corner, every imperfection. "So this is it," she said finally. "Your little place." I ignored the jab and went back to the flowers. "It's home," I said, simply. She looked around again, then focused on the wedding binder lying on the counter. "I heard you're having the ceremony in a backyard," she said, her tone caught somewhere between disbelief and amusement. "That's cute." I kept my voice calm. "It's exactly what I want." Denise let out a soft laugh. "Sure, that's what people say when they can't afford something bigger." She wandered closer, touching the edge of the binder as if she owned it. "You always were the modest one. Guess that hasn't changed." I straightened, feeling my heartbeat steady rather than quicken. "You came here to say something, Denise." She tilted her head, pretending innocence. "I just wanted to check in. You know how Mom worries. She said you've been a bit distant lately." The words landed with quiet irony. I met her gaze. Funny. Distance usually happens when no one bothers to notice you for years. Denise smirked. "Oh, come on. You always make things sound so dramatic. You were just too quiet to notice how much attention you actually got." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes were sharp. I could hear the echo of every family dinner, every moment where my voice was drowned out by hers. The memories pressed against my ribs. I set the vase down carefully. "Do you remember my graduation?" I asked quietly. "You were late because you had a hair appointment. Mom said it was fine because you had a lot going on." She shrugged. "I was busy. You know how life gets. Or maybe it just wasn't important enough," I said. My voice was calm, even detached, and that seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. Denise crossed her arms. "You're really going to bring up old stuff now? I came here to be nice." Nice isn't the same as kind, I replied. Her eyes narrowed. Wow. You've changed. I smiled, but it wasn't the kind she expected. That's what people say when they realize they can't talk to you the way they used to. For a moment, silence filled the room. The faint hum of the refrigerator seemed to grow louder. Denise looked at me, trying to measure whether I was serious. She finally said, half laughing, "So am I supposed to expect an invitation or what?" I picked up the wedding binder and closed it gently. Don't wait for one. The air between us shifted. For the first time, Denise didn't have something clever to say. Her smile faltered, her mouth half open, as though words might return if she just waited long enough. I walked to the door, held it open, and said softly, "Take care of yourself." She hesitated, then lifted her chin, pretending not to care. "Well, good luck with your backyard wedding." She stepped into the hallway, and I closed the door before the echo of her heels faded. Inside, the apartment felt lighter. The flowers on the table caught the last of the sunlight, and for the first time I noticed how quiet peace could feel. Not the kind that asks for permission or forgiveness, just the kind that comes after choosing yourself. 2 days before the wedding, the sky was overcast, the kind that hinted at rain, without ever letting it fall. The air carried that strange stillness before a storm, heavy and waiting. I parked outside my parents' house, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands gripping the steering wheel. The house looked the same as always, perfectly trimmed hedges, neat white shutters, but something in me knew this would be the last time I walked through that door as their daughter. When I finally rang the bell, my mother opened the door almost immediately. Her eyes widened in surprise, but she managed a smile. "Leah, we weren't expecting you." Her voice had that measured politeness people use when they aren't sure what's coming. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. My father was in the living room reading the paper. Denise sat on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. I stood near the doorway, straightening my shoulders. "I came to tell you something," I said. Mom frowned. "What's wrong?" "There'll be a wedding," I said evenly, "but you're not invited." The room went still. Denise's head snapped up. My father lowered his newspaper, his expression hardening. My mother's voice broke the silence. "Leah, don't do this," she said, taking a step forward. "You'll regret saying that. We're still your family." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment I almost believed her. But then the memories came back, every small dismissal, every time they called my dreams small, every moment I stood alone while they cheered for Denise. My father's hand slammed against the table, the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. "You're humiliating this family," he barked. "No," I said quietly. "I'm saving it from more shame." Denise laughed, short and cruel. "You'll regret this when no one shows up to your little garden party." I turned to her. I'd rather stand alone in honesty than surrounded by people who pretend to care. Her smile faltered, but she rolled her eyes. "You're being dramatic, Leah." "You always were." "Maybe," I said, "but at least now I know it." My mother's voice softened as she reached for me. "Sweetheart, don't let pride ruin your day. Families fight, but weddings are meant to bring people together." I stepped back, my voice calm but firm. Families are supposed to protect one another, not measure who's worth celebrating. My father stood up, his face red. "You're making a fool of yourself. Everyone will talk about this." I met his stare. "Let them. They've talked about me my whole life anyway. I'm done living by their version of who I should be." Denise crossed her arms, muttering, "You always did have a flair for martyrdom." I smiled faintly. "No. Just clarity." For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt thick, heavy with things that would never be said. I looked at each of them in turn, the father who valued reputation over love, the mother who mistook silence for peace, the sister who believed cruelty was confidence. "Respect isn't a gift you give," I said softly. "It's one you earn." I turned and walked to the door. No one stopped me this time. The sound of the latch clicking behind me was sharper than I expected, final and quiet all at once. The sky had begun to drizzle, cool drops landing on my face as I stepped outside. I didn't run to my car. I just stood there for a moment, breathing in the wet air, letting the weight slide off me like rain. When I finally walked away, the house behind me looked smaller, almost unfamiliar. For the first time in years, I felt light, not because I had won, but because I had chosen myself. 6 months later, spring arrived quietly in Boise. The air smelled of rain and wildflowers, and the garden behind Adam's mother's house had grown lush with soft green vines and white lilies. That was where the wedding took place. Simple, small, and filled with people who smiled because they meant it. Leah wore a flowing ivory dress that brushed the grass as she walked down the aisle. There were no chandeliers, no orchestras, no grand gestures, just laughter, sunlight, and warmth. When Adam took her hand, the world seemed to pause, as though peace itself had stopped by to watch. The guests raised their glasses under strings of lights, the air full of music and gentle joy. No one asked where her family was. No one needed to. What mattered was the way Leah looked at Adam with calm certainty that she had chosen her own happiness, and for the first time, it had chosen her back. A few weeks later, rumors began to spread around Boise. The Mortons, once a name that carried weight at every charity gala and business dinner, were now quietly avoided. Neighbors stopped calling, and invitations that once filled their mailbox grew fewer. People whispered about favoritism, cruelty, and the viral clip that had shown Denise laughing about her sister's pathetic little backyard wedding. It had been recorded at a salon and posted online by someone who recognized her. The comments were brutal. Sponsors pulled out. Within a month, her television contract was terminated. Their mother tried to defend her, but no one wanted to listen. Their father, humiliated, stopped attending social gatherings. The same pride that had once defined their family now became their downfall. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Leah from Grandma Helen. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakable. Inside was a short note and a copy of a new will. Helen had rewritten everything, leaving her estate entirely to Leah. At the bottom in her careful script were the words, "For the one who gave without asking." Leah sat for a long moment reading those words again and again, not with excitement but with quiet release. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about being seen. Later that evening, she stood in her kitchen, sunlight slanting through the window. On the counter sat the old blender, the same one her parents had given her, with condescension disguised as practicality. She placed strawberries, milk, and ice into it, pressed the button, and smiled at the steady hum. "Guess it came in handy, after all," she said softly, sipping from the glass. The apartment was filled with gentle stillness, the kind that comes after storms have passed. For the first time, silence didn't hurt. It felt like a promise kept. Peace has a sound silence, finally kind. In every family, fairness isn't measured by money, but by respect. When love becomes conditional, it loses its meaning. Standing up for yourself isn't revenge, it's reclaiming your worth. True peace doesn't come from being accepted by others, but from accepting yourself. It takes courage to walk away from people who diminish you, but sometimes that's the only way to make space for the love that was waiting all along. Thank you for listening till the very end. Have you ever felt unseen in your own family? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might help someone else find their strength. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every act of courage deserves to be remembered.